I remember the sound first, that dull, hollow crack when I pressed my boot against what used to be a proud deckboard. It had only been 5 years since we built it. We'd chosen premium-treated lumber, paid extra for the green-tinted planks, the kind the store promised would last decades. But as I crouched down that morning, the wood peeled apart like damp cardboard. My fingers came away coated with black rot and a faint smell of acid and decay. That smell, part fungus, part chemical, has a way of lingering in your mind more than your hands. That was the day I began to wonder whether we had forgotten how to make things last. Because somewhere across the world, in Japan, there stands a wooden pillar cut from a tree felled in the year 594. It holds up the central pagoda of Hōryū-ji Temple, a structure that has endured earthquakes, typhoons, wars, and 15 centuries of rain. The wood has darkened, hardened, and settled into the stillness of time itself, yet it has never surrendered to rot. And in Scandinavia, Viking longships made from oak and sealed with a tar black as midnight once crossed the brutal North Atlantic, surviving storms that would break steel hulls today. In Europe, timber-framed houses and stave churches from the Middle Ages still stand, their beams as solid as the day the craftsman raised them. It doesn't feel like nostalgia anymore. It feels like an accusation. How did they, with their simple tools and no pressure treatment, build wooden things that could stare down centuries while ours crumble before our children are grown? I started by looking at the trees themselves. Modern forestry is efficient, almost industrial in its rhythm. We grow trees like crops, fast, uniform, impatient. The lumber industry wants volume, not wisdom. These fast-grown trees are mostly sapwood, the outer, living tissue that carries water and nutrients. Sapwood is soft, light, and full of sugar, perfect food for fungus and insects. Inside that ring lies the heartwood, the old central core. The tree slowly fills with natural preservatives, phenols, tannins, resins. That's what ancient builders prized. They understood that the best timber was not alive, it was seasoned by death, its own chemistry transformed into armor. But today, when we buy a plank, we're really buying mostly sapwood, cheap, pale, eager to rot. I thought about my grandfather's woodshed, still standing after 40 years. When I was a child, he used to tell me, wood should age with you. He never used fancy coatings or weather-resistant polymers. He simply chose old-growth oak, dense enough that each board rang like metal when struck. Now, that kind of wood barely exists outside of museums. The modern solution was supposed to be clever. Take this vulnerable lumber, put it into a vacuum chamber, suck the air out, and force chemicals deep into its pores. That process, pressure treatment, was meant to give wood an artificial heart chemistry instead of nature. The result was a generation of green-stained boards preserved with chromated copper arsenate, or CCA. It was effective, frighteningly so. Arsenic leached from the fibers, killing fungus, bugs, and almost anything else that touched it. But as tests later showed, the poison didn't stay put. It seeped into soil, playgrounds, even garden beds. The industry quietly replaced it in 2003 with newer formulas, ACQ and CA. Safer, supposedly. But I've seen what they do to metal fasteners, ordinary nails eaten away as if by acid. The copper in these treatments reacts with steel, corroding it until structures literally fall apart from the inside. We solved one danger by creating another. And in wet climates, these modern treatments often fail anyway. I've pulled apart railings less than 10 years old and found black lines of decay crawling beneath the surface, as if the wood itself were rejecting what we injected into it. That's when I began to feel the unease that drives all engineers toward history. We've built skyscrapers, rockets, cities, but maybe, in our rush forward, we left behind quieter forms of genius. The medieval builder, the shipwright, the temple carpenter, they all worked without our chemistry, yet their work endured longer than our patents. Standing in the cold air beside my ruined deck, I realized the rot wasn't just in the wood, it was in our methods, Our mindset: we build fast, coat faster, and hope the guarantee outlasts the mortgage. But wood doesn't care about warranties. It listens only to time, water, and the patient art of preservation, an art we abandoned. I went back inside that evening, the smell of damp timber still clinging to my clothes, and opened an old engineering text about naval construction. In the margins, someone had once written a single word in pencil: tar. A word so simple, so ancient, it felt like a whisper from another age. That night I made a promise to find out what those ancient builders knew that we don't. Maybe the answer wasn't hidden in a laboratory or a chemical formula. Maybe it was hiding in the smoke of an old pine kiln, in the charred surface of a Japanese plank, or in the faint beeswax scent of a European cathedral door still standing after 600 years. And so I began the journey backward to study not what we can manufacture, but what we once understood. The search began in a strange way, not in a library, but on a coastline that smelled of smoke and salt. I found myself standing on the windswept shores of western Norway, where pine trees grow in thin soil above ancient tar pits. The locals still call them kjerregruver, tar wells. They say the Vikings once built furnaces here, hidden deep in the forest, where smoke curled up through the moss like breath from the earth itself. And as I knelt near the blackened ground, I could still smell it. The faint sweetness of burned resin, the ghost of pine tar. Archaeologists discovered that those pits weren't small experiments, they were industrial. Each kiln could render out 50 to 80 gallons of thick, sticky tar from pine stumps and roots. This wasn't a backyard craft. It was organized production, the backbone of a maritime empire. The Vikings used around 130 gallons of this tar for a single longship, brushing it into every seam, every plank, every nail hole. I could imagine the scene: shipwrights in heavy wool working under gray skies, dipping brushes into cauldrons of black liquid that hissed as it met the cool hulls. The smoke would cling to their hair and clothes for days. That tar was their lifeline. It waterproofed the ships, but more than that, it carried within it the same defensive chemistry that protected living pine trees. Phenols, resins, and pitch compounds, natural antiseptics that made the wood poisonous to the fungi and worms that wanted to eat it. When I rubbed some raw pine tar between my fingers, the smell pulled me centuries back. It's dense, smoky, medicinal, like the memory of fire. I realized this was their preservation system, distilled directly from the forest itself. No arsenic, no copper, no corporate formula. Just wood protecting wood. The same logic guided builders halfway around the world. From Norway I traveled east to Nara, Japan, the home of Hōryū-ji, the temple that had haunted my thoughts since the beginning. The pagoda's wooden pillars, smooth and golden under the light, had been standing since 607 AD. The air inside the temple smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The monks spoke of hinoki, Japanese cypress, revered not only for its fragrance but for its almost supernatural durability. Its heartwood, they explained, was saturated with natural oils that resisted rot, much like the tar oils of the Vikings. But the Japanese did something even stranger. They burned their wood before using it. It seemed insane at first, deliberately charring what you meant to preserve. Yet the technique, called yakisugi or shosugi-ban, was pure material genius. The builders would hold each plank above a controlled fire until the surface turned black and crackled, then quickly quench it in water. The result was a thin layer of carbon that sealed the softer fibers beneath. I watched a craftsman demonstrate it one morning. The flames licked the wood, singing a deep hiss as moisture boiled away. The smell was sharp and sweet. When he brushed the soot off, the plank glowed like obsidian, streaked with silver. "This," he said, tapping the charred face, "is protection. Water cannot enter what fire has already claimed." It made sense. Carbon is hydrophobic, and termites cannot eat what's already burned. The layer also shields against ultraviolet light, the silent killer of modern paint. And after charring, they coated the boards with oil, which seeped into the microcracks, hardening them. The result? Siding that lasts a century or more, needing only a touch of oil every few decades. It was in that moment, standing there with soot under my nails and the smell of smoke in my hair, that I began to see the pattern. Each ancient culture had found a way to turn destruction into protection. The Vikings boiled and burned pine to extract tar. The Japanese burned the wood itself. Both used fire to outwit decay. Europe had its own approach. In medieval guild workshops from France to Norway, carpenters kept barrels of boiled linseed oil and beeswax beside their benches. They weren't painters. They were chemists without the title. Linseed oil, pressed from flaxseed, was their deep preservative. When heated, it polymerized, turning from a liquid into a solid network that hardened inside the wood fibers. It didn't seal the surface like paint. It merged with the material, feeding it from within. For the final touch, they mixed beeswax with turpentine, a solvent distilled from the same pine resin as Viking tar, and rubbed it on by hand. It filled the pores, gave the surface a soft, water-shedding glow. Some formulas even added pine resin and stone powder for color and endurance. At Stavanger Cathedral, scientists analyzing old repairs found precisely that mixture. Pine tar, resin, beeswax, inorganic fillers. It had survived 700 years of rain and salt air. As I studied those formulas, I realized the brilliance wasn't in any one ingredient. It was in the balance. Pine tar repelled water and killed fungus. Boiled linseed oil hardened the wood's interior. Beeswax sealed the pores from outside. 3 materials, all from nature, working together, a chemistry older than chemistry itself. The more I compared notes between cultures, the more it felt as if humanity had once spoken a common language of material wisdom. Vikings, monks, and cathedral builders, separated by thousands of miles, all listening to the same teacher, the tree. We, on the other hand, have stopped listening. We invented synthetics to dominate nature rather than cooperate with it. And in doing so, we broke the conversation. As the sun set behind the pagoda's roof, its curved eaves catching a golden glow, I couldn't help thinking how little those ancient builders wasted. Even the fire that threatened destruction became part of preservation. There was beauty in that paradox, a humility that modern engineering rarely allows. When I flew home, my notebook was blackened with soot fingerprints and streaks of resin, but it contained a single unifying thought. The secret wasn't lost at all. It had simply been silenced by our own arrogance. Now all that remained was to bring it back to life, not in theory, but in practice. To mix, heat, and test the very same materials our ancestors trusted. The next step would be dangerous, messy, and possibly enlightening: to rebuild the formula of the masters with my own hands. The first time I opened the jar of raw pine tar, the scent hit me like the memory of an ancient forest set on fire. It was sharp and smoky, almost medicinal, with a depth that felt alive. I could imagine Viking craftsmen crouched beside their kilns, that same smell thick in the air, a reminder that chemistry once began with instinct and smoke, not spreadsheets. This would be the backbone of my experiment, not just to copy their method, but to understand why it worked, because nothing about this mixture was accidental. Pine tar, boiled linseed oil, and beeswax, each one contributed a property the others lacked, and together they formed something stronger than the sum of their parts. I started with the pine tar. Historically, the best came from the heartwood and roots of pine trees, where resin was most concentrated. When heated slowly, the volatile compounds separate, dripping down as thick black tar, while the rest burns away into gas. For centuries, this was one of Sweden's greatest exports. Stockholm tar, they called it, shipped by the barrel to shipyards from London to Lisbon. Every navy relied on it. Pine tar is, in many ways, a tree's immune system made liquid. It is profoundly hydrophobic, water cannot mix with it. But more importantly, it carries phenolic acids and creosote-like compounds that stop fungi dead in their tracks. To a living pine, these are defenses. To a craftsman, they are preservatives. Rub it on wood, and you are giving that wood its own second skin. Next came the heart of the formula: boiled linseed oil. The word boiled is misleading today. The cans sold in hardware stores are rarely boiled at all. They're mixed with metallic drying agents that simulate the effect. True boiled linseed oil, however, is something entirely different. The medieval method involved heating the oil until its molecules began to change, thickening, polymerizing. When it cools, it doesn't stay a simple liquid. It hardens over time, bonding with the wood itself. When I brushed a drop across a piece of oak, it sank in instantly, disappearing into the grain like ink into paper. Over hours, it would oxidize, transforming from oil to solid polymer, a flexible film that reinforces the cell walls from within. I thought of it as giving the wood a skeleton, invisible but enduring. The third ingredient was the most humble, and yet the most elegant: beeswax. I melted a small block in my hand and felt its strange paradox: solid but yielding, like muscle under skin. When dissolved in turpentine, it becomes a soft paste that spreads thin and even. Beeswax doesn't sink in like oil. It lingers on the surface, closing the pores, giving the final touch of waterproofing and a gentle sheen. It's the armor, not the skeleton. But what makes beeswax special isn't just its barrier against moisture, it's its renewability. Unlike varnish, which cracks and peels, beeswax can be warmed and rebuffed. It breathes with the wood. I realized then that the old craftsmen didn't think of wood as something to seal off from the world, they simply gave it a way to survive within it. When combined, these three substances create a perfect dialogue between depth and surface. The oil carries the tar deep into the fibers, hardens, and locks it in place. The wax sits atop it all, deflecting rain and sun, yet soft enough to be repaired. Nature's logic layered protection without suffocation. The chemistry is remarkable, even by modern standards. Pine tar's phenolic compounds inhibit microbial growth. Linseed oil's polymerization creates a flexible matrix. Beeswax's long-chain esters repel water and ultraviolet radiation. It's a complete system: biological defense, structural reinforcement, and environmental shielding, all drawn from plants and insects. When I mixed the three for the first time, I felt something both scientific and sacred about it. I worked slowly, measuring equal parts, watching the viscosity change as the materials began to merge. The color deepened from amber to bronze to near black. I could smell every civilization that had ever trusted this recipe: the forests of Scandinavia, the temples of Japan, the workshops of medieval Europe. It struck me that for thousands of years, we had already mastered sustainable chemistry before the term even existed. Every component was renewable, biodegradable, and non-toxic. We lost that not because it failed, but because it didn't fit the economics of speed. And so, as I sealed the jar and watched the mixture settle into stillness, I thought about what we traded for: convenience, patience, tradition, and the intimacy of making. Tomorrow, I would test it, heat it, stir it, and finally feed it into raw wood. Not a simulation, not a digital model, but the old ritual itself. A part of me felt nervous. What if it didn't work? What if the old master's secrets depended on some nuance I couldn't see, a rhythm lost in the centuries? But another part of me, the engineer who still believes in evidence, felt something close to excitement, because I was no longer just reading about their genius. I was standing in the same smoke, touching the same materials, and preparing to watch dead wood come back to life. I began early, before the sun had fully broken the mist. The workshop was cold enough that my breath drifted like smoke, and the jars on the table gleamed in the pale light: pine tar thick as syrup, linseed oil, the color of old honey, turpentine clear and sharp like spirits, and a small block of beeswax that looked almost alive. Everything about them felt ancient, like I was about to perform a ritual rather than an experiment. I grated the beeswax first. The shavings curled off the block in thin golden ribbons that caught the light before falling into the glass jar. Then I measured the liquids, equal parts, as the old formulas said. 1 part turpentine, 1 part boiled linseed oil, 1 part pine tar. Each ingredient had its own weight, its own voice. The turpentine hissed when poured, sharp and clean. The linseed oil slid down thick and patient. The pine tar resisted, clinging to the spoon as if it didn't want to leave the forest. When I stirred them together, the mixture swirled into a deep amber that slowly turned darker, richer, until it looked like molten bronze. But it was the smell that transformed the room. A blend of smoke, pine, and something faintly sweet. It reminded me of firewood after rain, of shipyards and temples, of the collective memory of builders. Then came the most delicate part, melting the wax. I built a double boiler, filling a pot halfway with water and setting the jar in its center. The old texts warned, no open flame ever. Turpentine can turn a careless craftsman into ash. So I kept the heat low, patient. The wax began to dissolve, thin streams curling like veins through the mixture. As it blended, the color deepened to a near black and thickened into a smooth, viscous liquid. It was no longer oil, no longer tar. Something new had been born, something that felt both organic and engineered. I could see faint ribbons of reflection swirling under the surface, like light moving through old amber. I tested the temperature with the back of my hand. Warm, not hot the way the Vikings would have applied it, so it could seep deep into the grain before solidifying. I carried the jar to the workbench, where a single board of raw pine waited, pale, soft, and vulnerable. Its surface was sanded smooth, the pores open like lungs. The first touch was transformative. As I rubbed the warm mixture into the wood with a rag, the pale grain darkened instantly, turning to a deep, smoky brown. The smell rose again, stronger now, tar and resin, mingling with the faint sweetness of beeswax. I worked slowly, pushing the finish into every groove, every knot, especially the end grain, where wood is most thirsty. It felt less like painting and more like feeding. Under my hand, the texture changed from dry to supple, from porous to dense. The board seemed to come alive, exhaling faint wisps of vapor as the turpentine carried the mixture deep into its structure. I could almost hear the fibers drinking. After 15 minutes, I wiped away the excess with a clean cloth, as the old instructions warned. You want the finish in the wood, not sitting on it. The surface, now clean, held a quiet sheen, not glossy, not dull, the kind of glow that belongs to things aged by time rather than polish. I left it to rest for a day. When I returned, the scent had mellowed, and the surface had hardened slightly under my fingertips. The grain looked deeper, as if lit from within. I added a second coat, thinner this time, and watched it settle into a warmer tone, a color between caramel and smoke. By the third coat, I noticed something strange. The board no longer felt like pine. It had the density of something older, stronger. When I tapped it with my knuckles, the sound was lower, resonant. It was as if the wood had remembered what it once was, a living thing built to endure. In the evening light, I leaned the treated plank beside an untreated one, pale, chalky, almost sterile in comparison. The contrast was startling. The finished board looked alive, like a piece of seasoned oak salvaged from an ancient beam. The untreated one looked like what it was, temporary. I ran my hand across the finished surface, smooth, warm, slightly waxed, yet dry. Water, I imagined, would glide off it the way rain slides off a leaf. As I stood back, watching the two boards side by side, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a kind of quiet reverence. This wasn't just a protective coating, it was a conversation with time itself. Every brushstroke had been a translation of ancient logic into modern hands. In that moment, I realized the beauty of the old system wasn't in its complexity, but in its humility. Nothing synthetic, nothing forced, only patience, observation, and respect for the material. The pine tar protected, the oil strengthened, the wax sealed, and together they created not an artificial armor, but a living equilibrium. Outside, the light was fading into blue dusk. The board glowed softly under the lamp, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined it as part of something larger. A ship's hull gliding through a northern sea, a temple beam humming quietly through centuries of rain. I closed the jar, sealing the leftover mixture for future work. The air still smelled of smoke and beeswax. And I thought, maybe this is what true engineering used to mean, not domination over nature, but partnership with it. I wanted to understand what had really happened inside that plank, not just what I saw, but what the wood itself had become. So I set up the microscope and sliced a thin section from the untreated pine, then another from the board I had coated 3 times with the old formula. The difference was visible before I even looked through the lens. The treated piece felt heavier, more substantial, as though the air had been pressed out of it. Under magnification, the untreated fibers looked like what they are, a forest of hollow tubes, open and thirsty, the microscopic straws of cellulose that make wood both strong and vulnerable. Each one could drink in water and, with it, decay. But the treated section was transformed. The hollow channels were filled with something darker, denser. The pine tar and linseed oil had fused within the fibers, forming a solid network that glowed faintly amber in the light. The beeswax, though not visible at this level, lay above it all as a thin, translucent film, the skin of the whole organism. It was strange, almost unsettling, to see that the process wasn't just coating the surface, it was changing the material itself. At a molecular level, the explanation is elegant. Pine tar contributes phenolic acids and creosotic compounds, complex molecules that bond to lignin, the structural polymer in wood. These molecules are toxic to fungi, so even if spores land on the surface, they find no food to grow. The boiled linseed oil, on the other hand, undergoes oxidative polymerization. Each molecule, exposed to air, reacts with oxygen and links to its neighbors, transforming from a simple liquid into a flexible solid chain that binds directly into the cell walls. It's as if the wood grows a skeleton inside its veins. And the beeswax, its hydrophobic long-chain esters, provide the final miracle. When buffed onto the surface, they organize themselves into microscopic crystalline sheets that repel water molecules. So when rain falls, the droplets don't soak in. They bead, gather, and roll away. It's the same principle a lotus leaf uses to stay clean. Together, these layers create what modern engineers might call defense in depth. Each compound serves a different function. The tar poisons the rot, the oil strengthens the body, and the wax shields the skin. And because all 3 are organic and flexible, the wood doesn't crack or trap moisture beneath a rigid shell. That's the fatal flaw of modern varnish: it suffocates the wood. When its surface breaks, water seeps in and gets trapped, starting decay from within. But the old system breathes. It moves with the seasons, expanding and shrinking without breaking. To test this, I placed droplets of water on both boards, the treated and the raw. On the untreated one, the water vanished in seconds, leaving a dark stain that spread outward like a bruise. On the finished piece, the drops stood perfectly round, glinting in the light, trembling but refusing to sink in. When I tilted the board, they rolled off and left nothing behind but a dry gleam. That was the moment I felt a strange shiver of satisfaction, not pride, exactly, but recognition. This was how the Vikings kept their ships afloat through years of storms, how Japanese temples endured monsoons, how medieval cathedrals weathered centuries, not through brute force or industrial coatings, but through an understanding of chemistry that came from observation and patience. We tend to think of progress as invention, but here was progress running backward, rediscovery instead of discovery. We had built a system entirely from natural intelligence, trees, oil seeds, and bees collaborating in silence. The same elements that had sustained life for millions of years could, when combined by human hands, preserve it indefinitely. As I looked again at the darkened wood under the microscope, I realized I wasn't studying an artifact, I was studying a conversation between biology and physics. A conversation our ancestors had understood intuitively long before we had words like polymerization or hydrophobicity. I stepped back from the bench, and the smell of the mixture still lingered in the air, faint pine, resin, smoke. It was comforting, grounding. I thought about how many generations must have stood in that same scent, trusting it to protect what they built. Their bridges, barns, ships, homes, they all carried this quiet science in their grain. We lost that not because it failed, but because it couldn't be patented. It required no factory, no brand, only time. And in the modern world, time is the one material we treat as disposable. I brushed my hand over the cured plank once more. It felt warm, alive. It no longer smelled like something finished, it smelled like something beginning. That night, I left the workshop window open so the scent could drift out into the cold air. In that smell was the memory of every craftsman who had ever learned from wood. Every moment fire had turned destruction into endurance. And I understood, finally, that this was more than preservation. It was resurrection. A week later, I took the 2 planks outside. The morning air was damp, heavy with fog that clung to the fields. One board, the untreated pine, looked pale, almost fragile under the gray light. The other, the one I had brushed and fed and polished until it seemed to breathe, carried the color of honeyed smoke. They felt like 2 different species, though both had been cut from the same tree. I placed them side by side on a small wooden stand in the open yard. I wanted to see what time and weather would decide. It was early winter then. The nights dropped below freezing, and the rain carried salt from the nearby coast. I left them there, uncovered, to face the same trial that every builder through history had feared: moisture, sunlight, and patience. But before the long test began, I wanted a moment of proof, something immediate. So I filled a small glass of water and poured a thin stream down the center of both boards. On the untreated wood, the droplets sank in instantly, darkening the surface like ink on paper. You could almost hear the fibers drinking. On the treated board, the water gathered into perfect spheres, bright and trembling, and rolled away as though repelled by an invisible force. When I ran my hand across it, it was dry, warm, untouched. That was it, the silent confirmation of what centuries of craftsmen had already known: pine tar, linseed oil, and beeswax. 3 simple gifts from nature, bound together by human patience, could create something close to immortality. I left the boards there, exposed. Every morning since, I've walked past them, sometimes brushing off a leaf or a patch of frost. The treated wood never lost its color. It seems to darken slightly with each sunrise, as if the light is helping it mature rather than destroy it. The untreated one has begun to gray, its edges lifting, its surface cracking into tiny fissures. Time has already chosen its favorite. But this experiment, this journey, has changed more than the wood. It's changed how I see everything we build. We live in a century of replacements, not repairs. We coat things in synthetic armor and call that progress, even as they crumble underneath. We chase speed, convenience, efficiency, and forget that durability once began not with chemicals, but with understanding. The ancient builders never fought against nature. They watched it, listened to it, and eventually learned to speak its language. The Vikings turned fire into protection. The Japanese burned cedar to make it weatherproof. The Europeans learned to make oil flow like blood through the veins of timber. Each discovery was an act of humility. Each method was a partnership. When I think of them now, I imagine a long lineage of hands, the tar-smeared fingers of a shipwright in the 9th century, a monk brushing oil onto temple pillars under the scent of incense, a medieval carpenter polishing a cathedral door in the pale light of morning. They never met each other, but through the materials, they were connected by smell, by touch, by faith, in the same silent chemistry. And now, standing here centuries later, I am part of that chain. I ran my fingers once more across the treated plank. Its surface was smooth, its tone dark and calm. There was something deeply human about it, not just in its endurance, but in what it represented. The refusal to accept that decay is inevitable, that quality must yield to speed. We often say that modern engineering is about innovation, but sometimes the greatest innovation is remembrance. In the end, the formula I rediscovered wasn't really mine at all. It belonged to those who came before, to the Vikings who cooked tar under the forest floor, to the Japanese masters who charred cedar against fire, to the craftsmen who mixed wax and oil by candlelight. They had already solved the problem we thought was modern. They left the answers in the smell of smoke, in the gleam of timber that never rots. We just needed to listen again. The boards will stay outside for a year. Rain will beat them, frost will tighten their grain, the sun will test their color. I'll watch, and wait, and measure. Maybe I'll find them unchanged, or maybe time will remind me that even the best knowledge is never perfect. But even if the wood darkens, even if the surface wears, I'll know one thing for certain: it will not fail quickly. And that's all I ever wanted, to build something that lasts longer than convenience, that carries within it not just chemistry, but memory. As I turned back toward the workshop, I caught a faint glint of light on the board, the curve of a droplet rolling off into the grass, leaving the surface spotless. For a moment, it looked like the wood was breathing, alive. And I thought, maybe the secret wasn't just how to preserve wood. Maybe it was how to preserve respect for time, for material, for the patience that once made us builders rather than consumers. So, if you ever find yourself with a raw piece of pine and a bit of doubt about what's possible, remember this: the recipe is simple, but the meaning is deep. Fire, oil, wax, and care. That's all it takes to make something endure. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to honor the hands that taught us how.